in the program, the first thing that we're going to do today is kind of talk through the kind of legal and political and ethical opportunities and challenges and tools that we can use when we're figuring out how to do this kind of sense of journalism that we're all talking about. We've changed a couple of things in the afternoon. We're going to compress it down so that we all kind of get an early leave, but we still want to kind of have those conversations about what the big opportunities are from a breaking news perspective and a investigative journalism perspective. But we're going to do it a little bit differently. After this panel, Taylor and I will kind of step you through exactly how that'll work. I'll let Emily Bell, the director of the Tower Centre, introduce our panellists, and we'll kick off.
Great. Thanks very much indeed, Fergus. And just to echo what Fergus said, I'm thrilled to see you all here again today. I went to the Yankees and the Red Sox last night, so it's quite surprising I'm here today. This panel, and I apologise for the kind of setup. When you come back next year, which I really hope you will, because we should have a wrap at the end of this, we will be downstairs in a fabulous, properly digital space. It always feels here that you're kind of addressing some kind of 19th century public meeting. But we thought this panel was really sort of an important linchpin in the proceedings, because for all the kind of excitement and possibility that we're looking at in terms of these new systems of reporting and collecting data, there are ethical, technical, and legal questions. And most journalists are just not even really thinking about technology yet, let alone thinking about the framework. So I'm really thrilled that we've got three panelists here who are probably sort of some of the best people in the world to sort of talk about this. To my immediate left, I've got Joanne Gabronovitz, who's the director of the Remote Sensing Lab in the University of Mississippi Law School, which is when I was at law school, I spent a lot of time talking about who was responsible if your chariot overturned and your bees escaped. And these things have changed, I hear.
Today you sue the bees.
Today you sue the bees, exactly. That would have made things so much easier, can I just tell you. I also know how to manumit Roman slaves in the market square as well. It was a very useful course. Next to Joanne, we have Rommel Lefkowitz, who is CTO at a brand new startup called ShareWave. And he's also an author for O'Reilly and is negotiating a lot of these questions, both as an author, but now also as a practitioner. And he's hired one of our dual degree students, which I'm very excited about. And to my far left, though only physically, Cord Davis, who's the co-author of The Ethics of Big Data, which is also now out in O'Reilly Press. We can have a different conversation about O'Reilly's monopolistic position in this later. So I wanted to sort of just kick off, Cord, if it's okay, I'll sort of go to you first. Just on the first part of the panel, just to talk about sort of reflections on yesterday. And how you're sort of what it's made you think in terms of, you know, the framework and the ethics of what we're talking about.
Absolutely.
You have something prepared, I
do.
see.
Yes. Just a few remarks. Thank you. Thanks for inviting me. Thanks for coming back. This was great yesterday. Was been thinking about big data and ethics is, as you might imagine, somewhat of a lonely pursuit sometimes, and so it's been nice to have everybody be immediately interested in and curious about and mentioning, without any sort of prompting, some of the ethical issues and questions that they might have. I wanted to tell really quickly the origin story for how we got onto the topic and how O'Reilly decided to move ahead with it. So in my day job, I do a lot of digital strategy and other kinds of design thinking and visual thinking facilitation and consulting with organizations, a lot of whom are starting to use big data in building their business models and products and services. And one of the things that I noticed that would happen a lot is we would be in working meetings, much like some of the breakout sessions we had yesterday, and there would be a technologist in the room and a product marketing person in the room and a product designer or manager in the room, and And the technologist would say something like, oh, we can do this with our data now. It's pretty cool. Our Hadoop cluster allows us to get, query faster and get results faster, and, we can cross-correlate, and it's disaggregated, and so on and so forth. And one of the product marketing people would go, whoa, that is awesome. Our customers are going to love that. And the second marketing person would go, yeah, but that's kind of creepy, isn't it? And the first marketing person would go, no, I don't think it is creepy. And the second marketing person would go, yeah, no, that's creepy. And they would go back and forth until you finally realize that this discussion was going to not go anywhere. And what I realized after experiencing and watching this more than a few times is that in the absence of a common vocabulary and framework for talking about our ethical positions in business environments, everybody reverts to their own moral code. And our own moral code is a great place to start. That's where we start with all of our values and what we believe in. But unless and until we have an understanding and an ability to explicitly express what our common and shared values are in the context of any enterprise, whether it's business, for-profit, nonprofit, legal sense, anything, then we aren't going to be able to have a productive ethical discussion about what we should and what we shouldn't do relative to our data. So I ended up having a conversation about that with an O'Reilly editor who immediately said, you should propose a book on that. So I did, and it was great. And Julie helped out a lot with that, so thank you publicly, my first chance to do that. A couple of things I heard yesterday that were interesting to me. Quite a few of you, regardless of whether you come from the technology perspective or the journalistic perspective, make this distinction between there being personal value in participating in sensor data collection and sort of collective value. So I heard a number of times about this distinction between it raining on people's lawns and making sensor data directly relevant to you as an individual, but also that in the aggregate, the collection of that data and the participation in the sensor deployment or management or what have you, that there is also some sort of collective value for that. And I would suggest that ethics can mirror that approach or that framework in quite the same way, which is in any individual instance in which your organization or you as an individual even are making a business or a technology or a legal decision based on your values, you're going to have to, or at least want to, I suspect, be in alignment with whatever those values are. Your actions, you're going to want to feel good about those things, but you're also going to want to understand that there's a collective value and that you and I share those things as members of a similar enterprise. So you might think about that a little bit. I think one of the best examples there was in the Amazon and the Amazonian example, this notion of a collection of geocoded data and it impinging or laying over indigenous population rights. So in the context of the data collection and aggregation and the use and analyzation of that data, we don't really know what the impact of that might be for any larger group, especially if they have a different culture, a different set of values, different all sorts of things. And understanding that distinction between what the individual motivations and values are and what the collective values are is an important aspect of that conversation. Just a couple more things here. I also heard yesterday, I heard this enough that I wrote it down, and I'm not sure where this comes from, and this might be good to chat about later in the panel. I heard a lot of people, especially from the technology perspective, or people who have engaged in just a few collaborative initiatives with other organizations. We hope to work with this organization or this type of organization. And then I heard this a lot. I heard, and hopefully some journalists too. And so that's just sort of an open question as to what that degree of engagement is and how we get that greater sense of collaboration between all of the different roles, all of the different organizations. We had a little bit of a conversation about that in my breakout group yesterday, realizing it's a very complex ecosystem and landscape, which I'll talk about directly influences the complexity of the ethical issues that are involved. So, another quick point. Everybody, I think, intuitively, if not explicitly, is aware of this fact that the pace of the technology advancement far outpaces our legislative agenda, and that the increasing size of the gap between what we can do with the technology and what we're allowed to do, either legally or not, especially in any particular geography. There was the example of it being illegal to take a picture from a drone of a property in Texas. The increasing size of that gap represents risks for your initiative in your organization. And so understanding where, the sort of tagline I came up with for that is, it's always possible to act in accordance with your values, but it's never possible to act in accordance with a law that doesn't exist yet. So there's a Venn diagram there that you can imagine in your head, that there's an overlap between what you might want to follow along in terms of understanding, and I'll talk about this more in a second, but understand what the sort of short and near-term legislative trends are that are going to change that landscape in the future, and how that might influence what you actually choose to do relative to what your identified values are.
We'll come back to that, because in a minute
Yeah,
I want to ask Jan about what is the existing framework, and then where do we actually see that going.
Yep.
Just at that point, because you said a couple of things there, which it's a good moment to flip to Rommel here, who said he had.
Sure.
Earlier said he had 3 observations, but also do kind of interrogate each other on these,
absolutely.
because I'm hearing some sort of similar things, but also some things where you're possibly different. So I don't know whether, Robin, you want to pick up on something ethical.
Well, I'm sort of sandwiched between 2 experts, and I'm not an expert in anything. So what I do is I try to rephrase the question so that it's an easier question that anybody can answer. And so, in listening to what was going on yesterday, I had the 3 observations in terms of how to frame the discussion. The first just being that when you start talking about law and ethics to a crowd of people who are interested in data and data collection, it's kind of an interesting cognitive dissonance in that the ethics and the law are pretty much always about ignoring any data. In fact, you start from a position that you sort of have this principle, and the research shows that if data is collected that challenges the principle, you cling to it. The more data you see that invalidates the principle, the tighter you cling to it. And that's sort of the feature of ethics. So anyway, the question that arose yesterday, somebody mentioned, was that the most important question was, who owns the data? Sort of the question of the age. And I think that's an unfortunate way of phrasing the question, because then we focus on sort of all the wrong things. Sort of like phrasing the abortion debate around, who owns the fetus, right? If you phrase it that way, you sort of go down a different set of frameworks than if you had phrased it differently. Where the ethical framework and legal frameworks around data have been, traditionally have been around how it is collected, right? So if you think about, medical records, right? And as an example, you want to do a story around pregnancies, rates in Manhattan. So you want to know who's pregnant, and it could be cancer rates, it could be, any medical fact. And if you called up a doctor and said, "Could you give me a list of your patients because I want to find out who's pregnant or not?" and they'd say, "Well, that's unethical." Right, but if you called everybody's house and you said, "Excuse me, is there a pregnant woman in this house?" And they told you, then that would be fine. But then you can start, so the difficulty with who owns the data is, what's the data that we're talking about owning here? Is it the fact that somebody might or might not be pregnant? And then you sort of start playing with this. It's like, well, supposing then you called somebody and they said, is anybody pregnant? They said, "It's none of your business," and hang up on you. And then you call the neighbors and you say, "Is anybody pregnant there?" And, "Oh, by the way, are your neighbors pregnant?" And they tell you, right? Because then you might be able to find out. Or because we're talking about censored journalism. Supposing we build a sensor, we have smart dust that from pheromones can tell from 5 feet away whether the person passing by might be pregnant or not and how far along she might be. And I collect the data that way, and I cross-reference it with, cell GPS data or check-ins on Twitter, and voila, I know who, I can build a map that way. And is that so in all of these things, the information about pregnancy or cancer or whatever medical information you're collecting, the information itself is not the issue. It's how you went about collecting it. And so that's kind of the right place to have the debate. And This actually came to light a couple of years ago. There was a sort of a famous case at Target had identified or was sending out coupons to pregnant women, and some father wanted to sue because his underage daughter was getting these coupons for things. And of course, the embarrassment in his case was, Target was right, and he didn't know that she had gotten pregnant. And again, it's if you buy a pregnancy kit and then a couple weeks later you buy certain vitamins, they can infer, without anything, is that ethical or not, or should there be laws about that kind of a thing or not? Anyway, and then lastly, the other observation about sort of defining censored journalism, which we did not do very crisply, so sort of where the boundaries of what's censored journalism versus what's stated journalism or whatnot, because if we wanted to pick, and this might be a good thought experiment, what is the sort of the poster child for censored journalism? The most popular story for censored journalism of the last year, one candidate I would argue would be the cicada tracker, and that's a feel-good story, and it's great participation and involvement, and one can sort of see the benefits. But I would argue that probably the most popular story was Anne Hathaway story, in that cameras are sensors, and so paparazzi are sort of the ancient art of censored journalism, and that seems less high-minded. And
This is not her haircut story either, is it? This is like a different.
no, this is a wardrobe story.
Right. Just checking.
So to the extent that we say censored journalism is really about collecting environmental data, then the issues are fairly clear. To the extent that it's about collecting personal information, then they're not so clear. And so we can make the problem simpler by just saying censored journalism is really about collecting meteorological data, which is a lot of the projects that we heard, and then therefore there are very few ethical or legal issues. But if we choose to include individual personal information, then we've opened a different can of worms. So anyway, we can define the question to be easy or hard.
Joanne, help us out here, which is what are the existing ethical codes and laws that censored journalists should be paying attention to or finding out about?
It's the Wild West. It really is, because the law is reactive by nature. We want a system and I'm only going to talk about the Anglo-American system because that's the one I know. But the law is conservative, small c. And courts don't go around looking for problems to solve. We have to go to a court if we have a conflict. And that's what I mean by being reactionary. So we have a series of laws that are often based on something that happened. The one you're probably familiar with is the protection of electronic records for renting movie films from film stores, because when Justice Bork was nominated to the Supreme Court, he was asked about what kind of movies he would watch in his spare time, and his detractors were hoping to paint a fairly prurient picture of him. And so they went and got the list of movies he rented from the video store. And the American public was so appalled, regardless of what side of the political fence you are, about that kind of intrusion. We have the Video Rental Records Protection Act. It's very specific and very narrow because there was a real event that catalyzed it. In remote sensing, we do have a national federal statute, the Land Remote Sensing Policy Act of 1992, which repealed the 1984 Land Remote Sensing Commercialization Act. And what catalyzed that was the commercialization of declassified spy satellites, in effect. That's what it was. And when a technology becomes mature enough to be commercialized, then we tend to start to see laws being made. What we're seeing now with data that Google gathers and collects is they're reacting. They're their stance, Facebook's stance. Facebook doesn't have a privacy policy, by the way, anymore. It's called a data use policy. They're not even pretending that they're protecting anybody's privacy. And what we see with Google is they basically go out, grab any data they can find anywhere, any place, anytime, ingest it. It's the big data sucking monster. They bring it in. And they have done a number of things that have caused reactions. So their first iteration of Street View, they went around collecting pictures of street level scenes, and my favorite story is that a guy was walking down the street and they got his picture, and he happened to be with his mistress, and his wife saw it on Google and said, "Who's that woman?" And he said, "Oops." And so he sued Google for invasion of privacy, even though he was in the street. And that's another thing, is the whole idea of public and private spaces is being turned on its head. And depending on what happens, we see reactions. So the most recent thing Google is doing now is they're receiving requests from people not to use my images, and they're pixelating them. Whereas, they weren't even telling people what they were doing anymore. Now they seem to be reacting when somebody is asking them to. And the fact is that they pixelated or obfuscated images of the White House because the State Department asked them to. And so it's a very selective Wild West thing where I think from a legal perspective, you would start out with the presumption of openness, because we're the people who invented the First Amendment. We tend to like that kind of thing. And then we're seeing the exceptions being made. So it's a very patchwork thing. And I can't give you a lot of comfort. Regarding yesterday, the most important thing I heard yesterday was in one of the morning presentations. I think it was the speaker from Reuters, I'm not positive of that, where he said, you have to rely on experts to read your sensor data. Don't do it yourself. And I will underline that 17 times, because reading, for example, a remotely sensed image is less a science and more an art. And there are people who have been working at it for a very, very, very long time, and there is a consensus that has been reached about how you do that. It's a difficult thing. And so you really do need to rely on the people who know what they're talking about. If you don't do that, you're going to create a chilling effect on what you do. People will see you using sensors, and you become part of the problem. If all you're doing is giving some kind of ad hoc but well-meaning interpretation. And I think that's incredibly important now, because the public has become more and more aware of all the technologies that are tracking them, their cell phones, their browsers, all sorts of things. And that's why drones have taken off as an issue huge time, because people are starting to realize that they're being tracked. RFID chips in Walmart and other things, all these things, there's an aggregation of awareness that we're seeing play out in the drone issue, that people are realizing that unbeknownst to them, they have been tracked, data is being gathered about their uses of these technologies, and we're starting to feel uncomfortable. The other thing is the Supreme Court has started to notice this. So last year we had a very, very important case, the United States versus Smith, where Mr. Smith was not the kind of person you would want your daughter to date. He was a drug dealer, he was a nasty man, and he was being surveilled by the Washington, D.C. authorities. They went to a court and they asked for a search warrant, and they wanted to put a GPS unit on Mr. Smith's car. So they got a search warrant that said, yes, you can put it on Mr. And that is his name, Smith. I'm not doing this. So they got a search warrant that said they could put the GPS unit on the car, They identified his vehicle, and there was a time limit. There was like 3 weeks in which the authorities could place the GPS unit on the car. Well, they put it on Mr. Smith's wife's car, and it was beyond the time period of the warrant. So Mr. Smith's attorney argued it was a warrantless search and therefore should not be upheld. And what the police argued first was, well, it is a warrantless search. That was a fruitless argument. But then, and this is the interesting part, they went on to say, this is not a search anyway. We are tracking. We are not searching. And the Constitution allows tracking. Mm-hmm. And the court went, And when they came out, now this is a court that does not agree on anything. Everything is 5-4, one way or the other. Here, everybody agreed that it was a search, but they all agreed for different reasons. And the way I read the case is, it's kind of like the justices looked at it and went, Fourth Amendment, 18th century language. GPS, 21st century technology. Well, if it looks like a duck and it quacks like a duck, it's a duck. It's a search. And the reason, the plurality reason that they gave was something along the lines you were saying, is if you have a GPS unit and Mr. Smith drops off his kids at daycare, then goes to the drugstore, then goes to a psychiatrist, and then goes to a divorce lawyer, you can start putting things together and say, Mr. Smith's life is in a crisis right now. And so they called it a mosaic approach to information. And this is a long way of saying that people are becoming aware of senses both in the public and in the law. The other thing I want to stress, as a non-journalist and as somebody who has had to learn remote sensing tech, my degrees are in history, literature, and law. So learning about technology has always been the most challenging part of, rewarding part of what I do. So I have to tell you, as an informed person, I think it's very important for you to know data is not information. Data is data. And it gets sliced and diced and chopped and interpreted, and that is where you fall into problems. And a few years ago, there was a policy analyst when the commercial remote sensing companies first came online. These were the companies that are using declassified spy satellites, high resolution. Mm-hmm. And he wanted to show how useful this data was. And so he bought himself some imagery. This is about 12, 13 years ago. He bought himself some imagery. He quickly analyzed it, and he put it online and said, there are missiles in North Korea. And what got him in trouble is not whether or not there were missiles in North Korea, but the way he analyzed it was so quick, was so fast, and he reached conclusions so quickly that the imagery community said, how could you do that? So this is a new data source. We even have to play with it first before we do it. He got fired, he lost his job, and nobody cared whether there were missiles in North Korea or not, because the so-called image activist behaved in such a way that he became the issue rather than the missiles in North Korea. And I think we're a little bit past that now, but depending on what you are sensing, what you're looking at, I think it's important to remember that. And then
Could I interrupt
Sure.
just before we get too far away from Mr. Smith, because you're talking about the GPS tracking
Right.
of Mr. Smith. And although the court agreed on that particular issue, I think in general, and if you could comment, things that happen in cyberspace are not considered, part of your domicile, so they can be sort of searched willy-nilly by the government in that, because it's not a search in that context. And if I have
that's an open question. In fact, the ACLU is working its way through the courts right now using data from cell phone towers. And they are, the police have gotten very sophisticated. They know what they need a warrant for and what they don't need a warrant for, and they know the part in between which has not been answered. So for example, if they want to monitor your phone, they know they have to get a warrant for that. But what if they go to the phone company and say, give me a data dump for all the data that passed through that cell tower from this date to that date? We'll be happy to sift through the data. That they don't need a warrant for, although the ACLU is challenging that. So this is what I mean about the Wild West. There are a lot of pending questions for which there's no answers.
It's also fair to say that, which I sometimes get in trouble for saying in a journalism school, particularly as a British journalist, that the job of the journalist is not always to uphold the law,
Right.
but to work within legal frameworks. There's a sharp intake of breath. Well, kind of like if it depends. It's a very Amerocentric view of the world that says, kind of
Gabe Woodward and Bernstein.
everything that the government does is right, and therefore you must always stick to the law, and the law is always right, as opposed to the public interest. So, often journalists are working within, an ethical framework, hopefully, and sometimes not within an ethical framework, as we know.
This
So,
is my question,
yeah.
actually, back to the topic at hand. So let's assume for the moment, which I'm going to disagree with, that it's not about ownership, but it's about the collection or the methodology by which you acquire that data. Would it follow then in your minds that the ethical and legal implications or framework ought to focus on the collection level of that activity and not the subsequent analysis or codification or storage or usage or whatever happens down the data exhaust trail?
Well, to some degree, the law already does. That's why the court in the GPS case said, let's look at how this behaves. How is this collected? And they didn't buy that it was tracking. They put all the information together and saw how it was collected, and for that purpose, it was a search. Regarding other kinds of collection, you're going to have auxiliary legal issues. For example, physical trespass. If you trespass onto somebody's property to get data, the data is one issue, but trespass is another standalone issue all by itself.
Right.
So there's going to be concomitant legal issues that do get raised by the collection of the data, but isn't triggered by the data itself.
This is actually, there's a clear ethical question around this, which is, especially related to sensor data, which in many cases can be at once removed from your physical presence, whether it's owned by you or the collector, regardless of the device of which it's collected through, which is, if you don't know that I'm violating your privacy, is your privacy actually being violated?
Yeah.
If a tree falls in the
Yes.
forest.
Yeah, well, it's,
Yeah.
but it's not a useless question.
No,
in
it's
that
a great,
sense,
it's a great question, and sort of actually that leads to a question I was going to put back to you, Cord, which is when you're writing your next book, and imagine it's on the ethics of censor journalism, where would you start that research? Is that the question? What are the right questions now for us to be thinking about?
Yes, yeah, so I would say a couple things real quick about that. One is, I think I have this notion, which I call individuals and organizations need to get better at maintaining the right perspective in that level of abstraction. A couple of you heard me say yesterday, ethics is a highly abstract topic, but has very real world consequences. And understanding where we're looking at and what level of detail is going to be most appropriate at either the technology, legal, or ethical level is going to be important. And so there's what I call the microscopic view, which is if you take too narrow a slice of what you're looking at and focus only on, for example, the privacy issues, you might miss the ownership or identity issues. So for example, in many online systems, how an organization technically defines in their database an individual, their identity, that has a lot to do with what you can even violate their privacy around.
Right.
So, you don't want to be too microscopic and focused on too narrow a niche of abstraction, I guess. But you also want to, take a little bit of a telescopic view so that you can understand the cultural, legal, social, political changes that are going to inform both the legal, ethical, and, technological decisions that people are going to make. There's this notion that your business processes and technical infrastructure can actually be conceived of as a physical manifestation of your ethical values. And the way in which those things operate are constructed by human beings who make decisions on a regular basis.
I mean, you're touching on some really interesting areas here for journalism, because that
Yeah.
idea of what is the digital fourth estate,
Yep.
has always been thought of as, how do you stand outside, government and commerce and produce a system of accountability and
Yep.
reporting back to the public.
Yep.
So it seems that what you're saying is that there is something within that as well about how journalism creates,
So I have an
manages
actual answer to
identity.
your question.
Yeah.
So given that sort of setup, I use the phrase the wild, wild west a lot as well, and, the follow-on I use, and there are no Pinkertons yet in that world. And so the little anecdote I think of is, historically, it took Upton Sinclair writing The Jungle for us to create legislation and changes in labor structures to fix rapid corruption and dangerous conditions in the meatpacking industry. It took Rachel Carson writing Silent Spring to do the same for environmental laws. Nobody has yet written the same story for data, and I think that journalism has a great opportunity to do that, telling stories about the human side of what's happening on, both on the receiving end and on the collective end of those data decisions.
Let me piggyback on that, because I thought about this last night. I think one of the projects, is it TOW or TOW?
TOW.
TOW.
TOW, no, we won't remove your car. and we rhyme with cow, which is, in fact, we used to have TOW cow, which has gone missing, but anyway.
The TOW Center might focus on, one of its projects is to gather a statement of best practices.
Yeah.
Because everybody recognizes that there are precious few answers to all of these questions.
Mm-hmm.
And everybody knows you're going to make a mistake, meaning the collective journalist community. By having a list of best practices that is brought together by practicing journalists based on journalistic principles, you can at least be seen to be trying. If you make a mistake, fine. Fraud, we're not going to forgive. And the difference between fraud or improper behavior and a mistake can be that statement that I'm trying to do the right thing under the circumstances for something that is a moving target. And so, for example, the American Society for Photogrammetric Engineering and Remote Sensing has a statement of ethics, and I worked with them on that. And it doesn't cover everything, but it's a starting point.
Mm-hmm.
And so, if I understand correctly, journalism does have its own code of professional behavior.
Yes,
And
not in Britain, but yes.
Well, see, you guys don't write down your constitution. I mean, that's the problem.
It's a very freeing environment to be in. We like case law and kind of all of that sort of stuff. But yes,
so
no,
if
we
you're gonna
don't.
write down those.
Don't write it down. Obviously that's
But
bad advice for journalists.
The point is
but,
that you do have a starting point that you can overlay the sense of journalism on.
Yeah, yeah.
But, so I would argue that to articulate that, right, what you're talking about, the two things that you can talk about are how you're going to collect the data and what are you going to do with it once you have it, right? The information, and there may be other stuff that you learn along the way, but it's really, you can't really talk about whether or not you're allowed to know certain things,
Yeah.
right? So really, all that's left is how did you collect it, and were you deceitful about collecting? Like, did you collect stuff, and then what did you do with it once you figured it out? So the tricky part about the collection and the deceit is when you collect information, right? So if you're just collecting sort of purchases at a Target, or looking at traffic patterns and who's walking, or driving past certain areas. Once you have all that, you can infer all kinds of stuff that you didn't set out to go get. So you might have started sort of with all the best intentions to do this completely harmless thing, and then it turns out that you now can discover something that you did not anticipate that you were going to discover. And does the fact that you sort of discovered it serendipitously absolve you, right? Because because this is the argument Google can make, right? Oh, I was taking pictures of the street. I wasn't expecting to catch anybody's mistress, so, it wasn't like I'm blameless because I was trying to do no wrong. And I think that's the difficulty is it's so, once you collect data, it's so fungible. And I mean, you were talking about the way you store the information and not maintaining identifiable information. Well, I mean, what we learned with the AOL release is you don't need that because you can infer it, right? Given 12 browser clicks, you can figure out, on average, you can figure out with 95% accuracy who that person was and identify them.
It takes 3 pieces of data to identify any individual, and if you can correlate those across any data sets.
Right, but so if you look at just browser, URL hits, apparently, with 12, you can figure that out.
And let me piggyback on that, because you said something very important before, that the journalist's job is not always to obey the law if the law isn't proper. I am less concerned about the government use of data than I am about private sector use of data, because we do have laws in place. We have the Fourth Amendment, we have the Electronic Records Act, we have HIPAA, we have all sorts of things, not perfect, but as a republic, we have dealt with the issue of overbearing government invading privacy of citizens. Now it's citizen to citizen that concerns me more. I was in a Walmart, and a young woman who was so happy and bright and had her brand new beautiful baby taking pictures for grandma and grandpa. The first thing the clerk asked for was the baby's birthday. They didn't need the birthday, but Walmart's going to track that kid for the rest of its life. And there's no law saying they can't do that. I am really much more concerned, and not only that, it's the private sector that has the cutting edge ability and knowledge to do this. The government is more restricted in many ways, not the least of which is financial. So I think the real concern about misuse of data right now is more the private sector than government.
Sorry. Yeah.
Just real quick, we've done some work on what I'm calling the creepy quotient.
Yes.
And our current, and actually, if anybody has any thoughts on this afterwards or now, would love to hear. The notion we've been working with is the difference between what you expect to be done with that data and what is actually eventually done with it. And the farther along you get in that data exhaust trail, especially with individual and for-profit corporations and their technological abilities today, the creepier it becomes.
And actually, so just bringing it back to journalism as well, I mean, we've had a couple of examples. I guess the most famous recent one was the gun ownership data map that was created by the paper in Westchester, which was taking public information widely available, publishing it, and creating an environment through, publication is an act which also changes the context of data. Yeah. And journalism is often that act, and how it presents and surfaces.
When I register a gun, I don't necessarily expect that to be published. That's one of those acts that is different than maybe what I might expect to be actually done.
And ethically, there was nothing wrong with what what was done. It was more a question of, kind of if you like, the sort of the context was changed, particularly by the kind of heat of the debate around it, which then allowed some latitude for authorities to say, well, we're not going to release the data in that format anymore.
And there the issue is you have all level governments, municipal, state, federal, collecting all sorts of data as part of their regular missions. That's what they do, everything from the census data to road quality. What we have now is technology that aggregates that data. And it's that active aggregation that puts it together that makes it available. Up until the time they published, if somebody had the time, effort, and inclination, they could figure it out too. But now it's so easy, that's what's triggering the concern.
And in that vein, another Columbia project is the declassification engine.
Which we're
So if you have the ability to collect all of these declassified documents and fill in the redactions with a large enough corpus, it just reminds me of that line from Sneakers, right? No more secrets, Marty. What do you do when the government can't keep secrets, right? So I think, I mean, you were less concerned about the government. I think the backlash is in the other direction, right? What censor journalism can do is track flights of airplanes, say, and publish
Yes.
some secret troop movements or
The rendition project,
The
which
rendition
I'm sure
project
everybody
was
here
right.
has seen, which is an amazing kind of thing. Is Fergus is waving at me in that ask questions kind of way. I'm going to let you all ask questions, but I'm too interested to stop. There's one more question. There's actually one more question, and then everybody can ask questions. Because this is not a democracy.
See, no written constitution.
No written constitution. I am the
So this is an 18th
I am the Queen in
tribunal.
Parliament. It's meant to be a powerless totemic, but I've gone crazy, and now you're all in trouble. Just sort of before we flip to the audience, the one question was really, as we're talking about all this, and we're talking about it and we talked about it yesterday, and because we're all great people doing wonderful projects, it's all in quite a kind of high-minded way. What are the not just in the kind of high-minded and the environmental and what we're doing good for society, though actually that would be good too. But this sense of like, where are the big opportunities? So each of you, none of you are running a newsroom, but if each of you were running a newsroom, where would you now be looking for going, right, okay, this is what I would do, and this is how I do it?
I've actually tried to start this work. I'm not a journalist, so I didn't get very far. I'm very, very interested in the human side of the technology decisions. So as engineers, as developers, as database architects, we're interested in problems, technology, in solving particular problems, using technology in a particular way. And I think it's fascinating how those decisions get either abstracted from business values or individual values or shared values in some sense, and just exploring what that relationship is between, what I think of as the human side of computer science or engineering or database design or, any kind of big data architecture challenge. And like I was saying a minute ago, this notion that business processes and technical infrastructure can be viewed from one perspective as a physical manifestation of our values, and just kind of exploring that as a journalistic topic.
Okay.
I think that would be, I would love to see a Wired 4,000 word article on that with, direct interviews with people who are, extremely knowledgeable about both sides of that question. So.
It's questions.
Hi. I talked about this in our small group yesterday, but I would love to hear kind of the bigger perspective. I've done 2 projects now that were relatively large. I've done a lot of little ones, but one was in Japan. We started a group called SafeCast. It's still working today. I'm not a part of it anymore, but where we give Geiger counters to people, we make Geiger counters, we aggregate all this data, and it's changed the story dramatically about Fukushima. We went into it in partnership with Keio University. They have a really great nuclear engineering department. The current project I'm working on, the mapping of the mangroves, also is in partnership with Conservation International, which has some of the top mangrove scientists in the world. There's a bridge between journalism and science. Journalists are not scientists because they shouldn't be, right? That's not what they do. But they do have to interpret, and they have to work with scientists to do that. My question is where's that line, right? If I can, as a journalist, go buy a bunch of sensors, or have a geek like me make a bunch of sensors and throw them out somewhere and see that there's some toxic outflow from some solid waste dump somewhere, and as like Public Lab has done, right, in Brooklyn, the veracity of the collection of the data, the rigor with which it was manipulated, et cetera, is going to come into question. And so that line has to be really clear, and I would love to hear more about that, because we're talking about like sensing in terms of existing data, but when you're generating new data, it's a different story.
Sure.
Let me try that, because remember me, history, literature, and law? Yeah. The analogy I give my students, they want to know, can I really do remote sensing law? I don't know any science, I don't know any engineering. I said, absolutely. And the analogy I give is an attorney practicing medical malpractice law. To do that, you have to know enough medicine to know how to apply the law, and the second thing you have to know is when to call an expert. And so it's the exact same thing. And I think what's really important is you cultivating experts that you can trust and rely on, and the two of you or three of you have enough time to work out your vocabulary. And if you do that, you'll be fine.
So I'll answer by changing the question. And then
You
answer.
warned us about that.
And what I would say is, so my interpretation of this cicada tracker, and I'll bring it back to your question, is that the sensors were not relevant. All the information could have been, well, first of all, if you had you could have done it with surface temperature and with a model that could predict it, so you could have done it with publicly available meteorological data and been equally accurate with a good model. And in terms of the data collection, you don't need the sensor collecting sort of real-time data every 10 seconds and whatever. Again, this is you could take a reading once a week and again have been close enough. That what distinguishes what we've been talking about, sensor journalism, from other kinds might be, well, this doesn't distinguish it. That journalism is not about discovering the science. It's different from science in that it doesn't care about the facts, the data, if you will. It cares about the engagement, right? The journalism, if I might, might be about making people care about the news more than it is about finding out so the scientist cares about finding out, whereas the journalist cares about making people care about it. So what was great, awesome about the Cicada Tracker project is it got people involved, so they were invested, so it built this sort of community and interest around this particular topic. And so if journalism and science are sufficiently distinct, right, what you're approaching is not so much around, the science of learning new things, but about how do I make people care about it, then it's a completely different thing.
Well, yeah.
I think it's if you want to reframe the question, I'm not a journalist and I'm at this conference, right? And the public lab people are trained as urban designers, not as journalists. So I think you actually also have to ask the question the other way around. Why is it that journalists are paying attention to all these other ways? It's because not only journalists are making the news nowadays.
Yes, I mean, we just, having just authored a report, co-authored a report where one of the key findings, well, not finding, but observation is there is no longer such a thing as the press addressing such a thing as the public.
Yes,
That, the point about how...
Well, we were all just people that showed up to do
Yeah,
work, right?
yeah,
Right?
yeah. And the...
We had journalists on board.
Yeah.
Who happened to write about it and get things.
I'll just add to that. I used to be a professional scientist, and so your question's interesting because I think whoever you are, whenever you throw sensors out into the world, you become a scientist to some degree, right? That's what you're saying. But the difference is if you're a scientist, you can't publish without peer review. That seems like a big difference. So
Right.
I'm sure there is some peer review journalism. No, but,
It's called the internet. That's right. Yeah.
Where does your credibility as a journalist/scientist come from relative to the peer review process and so on?
I mean, are these partnerships as important as I think they are, I guess?
I think that's a great question, which is, are these
To the
partnerships?
Partnership with
yeah.
the experts?
Right.
Yeah.
In my
At
opinion,
the start, right.
in the opinion, I think it is.
Right. Scott. Oh, sorry.
I have to push back a little about this notion that it's the collection of the data at which is situated the ethics. As a journalist, we function under a somewhat different set of kind of special ethics. If we had to worry about the ethical collection of the data that we then sort of take, but as distinct data We have a very different set of guidelines, which is guided both by a special set of ethics and also the concept of newsworthiness.
Yeah, for the record, Robert and I haven't gone mano a mano on that yet, but I agree. I think there's a hierarchy there.
Daniel Ellsberg is really allowed to have this information after all is classified, so
Yeah.
we can't help you.
So this is the agency issue. What you're saying is it was illegal for him to give you the information, but you're blameless. But if we're talking about legal and ethical frameworks, then we've just moved the problem to now, Daniel Ellsberg, was what he did illegal or unethical or and so by saying, oh, I'm not going to collect this data, I'm going to give sensors to other people and they will collect the data, so therefore I don't have an ethical issue. All you've done is move, right? That's the agency problem of there's still an issue even if it's not yours. Now they have to worry about it.
And if you are, for instance, a publisher, and you say you're the New York Times and you have live data tracking of somebody or something on your website or through your app or whatever, then presumably that is protected by the First Amendment. Isn't it?
Well, but also to get back to your point about the government and,
Yeah.
and Daniel Ellsberg being the case in point, right? Possibly the issue is that your ethics are at odds with the law.
I was just going to say, you cannot use the terms illegal and unethical interchangeably.
No.
Because I would argue that what Ellsberg did was clearly illegal, but it was highly ethical, in my opinion.
And the
There are plenty of
yeah.
examples
Yeah.
of government leaks that would be unethical.
Dave?
So just a couple of observations and a question. So one is, actually, I think 5% of every broadcast is data journalism. It's just called the weather. They're using sensors and they're conveying in a way that's interesting to you and making it relevant, and it's all data journalism. And so there might be something interesting. As boring as we may all think the weather is as a part of journalism, there may be something to learn from the people who do the weather.
Can I steal that? That's a good one.
It's also data point that actually the forecasting methods used by, for instance, Nate Silver are pretty much exactly developed along the same modelling lines
Right.
as the weather.
And as a
And
matter
it's
of,
Oh,
as a
sorry.
matter of law.
If someone could do decent weather reporting, I would be in heaven. I spent 10 years at The Guardian saying, can we please have better weather, social weather, more up to date, our own weather?
Which is hilarious because the British are obsessed with it.
It's a very wet
and-
Yeah, like America isn't.
And I think it's and one reason to go there is because there is actually something that happens, like we're not actually asking people to crowdsource the weather for us. We've totally professionalized it, and so there is like less of a community. There's still people who do it out there, but it gets very different. And also, whether like telling you about the weather is very different than talking about climate change. You can try to link the two, but people don't actually care about how the weather was generated. They just want to know, is it going to be sunny tomorrow? And so it kind of those things become kind of. I think it's worth talking about whether those things are related, and so I think there's a rich space
And
there.
as a matter of law, the important part about the point that you're making is if you have records, like the weather records, that are kept as a matter of course for the purpose of documenting the weather, those are automatically admissible in court. Because the reason they were collected was not to bias one party or the other. The reason why they were collected was to attest to what the weather is. So if you do have sources of data that you don't have to go through the pedigree or what's called the Daubert test, you're much better off. And by the way, does anybody here know about the Eros Data Center in Sioux Falls, South Dakota? That is where we have all the unclassified satellite data and aerial data going back to the 1930s. And it's a fantastic source of satellite data and aerial data. And they have an online presence, and you can look at thumbnails and you can find out what you want. And if you're looking for imagery for a particular day, they can help you find it.
So the second observation and question I was going to make is I actually do think there is an institution that actually has been grappling with ethics around sensors and data, and they're called universities, and they have IRBs, and they make you go through these very annoying processes to have values and ethics reviews of the research you're going to do. And so I think most people I ever talk to who's gone through an IRB find it an enormous pain in the butt, although they'll often find there's like a glimmer of interesting knowledge they got out of it. And so one of the questions I have is, can journalists learn from IRBs? Is there something there? Can they be made more streamlined and easier to do? So I think that's kind of like there's potentially a rich conversation. I know nothing about it, so if it's a completely stupid idea, I'm very open to that. And then linked to that is I'd love to know from Cord is you say you're consulting with companies and helping them. So similar to the IRB question, who are the companies out there, and you don't have to name them by name, that are doing what are their best practices? What are the questions they're asking? What's the process they have set up internally? And can that apply to journalists or the rest of us in some interesting way?
Okay.
I could give, yeah.
Yeah,
Or I
do
could
you want to
tell
do that, and I'll
offline or
come to
whatever,
Matt.
yeah.
He's.
Before I get started on IRBs, I just want to you all in the horrible. They are the worst goddamn thing on earth. If you are a journalist and have to go through an IRB, you will be screaming prior restraint at the top of your lungs. You will be wishing you had a first-year law student just blow that shit right out of the water and move on with your goddamn life. However, I think there is a portion of IRBs that I think censored journalists should pay a lot of attention to, and that is the idea of informed consent. A lot of these privacy issues and these worrisome issues go away if the person involved in it directly and even semi-identifiably knows that's going on and agrees to allow it to go on. So, hey, can we put a sensor in your yard and let us explain to you what it's going to do and how it's going to work, and here's what it's going to look like, and here's what data we're going to gather. Is that okay? Sure. Problem solved.
You know, the origin of informed consent is from the Personal Genome Project at Harvard Medical School, and what they realized is there is no more uniquely identifiable information about you or data about you, to be more precise, than your DNA. In fact, there is only one string of data about you in the entire universe. So access to that automatically can correlate with any other available data. And what they realized is if you participate in this project, there's absolutely no way that they can prevent for all time to come that they could protect your anonymity and thus your genomic data, which could have lots of consequences down the road. So if you participate, you actually have to take a test that you have to get 100% on, and you have to take a course that I think is several hours long. And when they say informed, they mean you have to be informed. Yeah.
Mark, sorry, yeah.
Just one other thing real quick. There are ideas and there are sensors and things like that that are passive, that do not gather private information,
Right.
not gather identifiable information. We've toyed around with putting like motion sensors in the hallways, counting the people who's
Yep.
walking by.
Right.
We're not taking a picture of it. We don't have any identifiable information.
Yes, you do have, at that point, you do have identifiable information. You can tell by, I fingerprint the gate, potentially, right? That is, so the pushback on this is, and this is what AOL learned when they anonymized their browsing data, and is that the difficulty with informed consent is that you leave some data scientists think about this problem for a week or two, and then they come up with a way of fingerprinting people, and then they can track it back and synthesize that information that nobody knew, even the people who were going to collect it didn't know. So the only way the informed consent can work is if you're committed to destroying the information you've collected after you've done like the project that you're going to do, so that you can't think of other things to do with it. And we don't do that. We figure, well, it's valuable data, we're going to need it, for something else later, and we hang on to it. And
Which is
so I think
precisely why I'm interested in the human side of that story.
So I think the crux of it is we don't destroy enough data.
And what is very true about informed consent is it's very fact-dependent. There are thousands of court cases where informed consent has been thrown out because when the court matches the facts to what they were told, they don't always match.
Mark.
I just want to add that, so we had to go through the IRB a fair bit, and there are a couple ways to approach it. One is the swearing, but I think you learn a lot by going through that process, right? There's a training process that you have to go through. It makes you very aware of what you're actually doing when you're putting sensors out or involving human subjects. So I think the training is really valuable. And also, if you think in terms of Wild Wild West, IRBs are struggling to keep up with what it means to take data this way as well. So by partnering, you have a back and forth that you're entering into a relationship with your institutional review board that
that actually helps them in their practice as well. So I think there's a lot to learn, even though it may add a layer to the process. I think it's a really valuable layer.
Just a warning, it is a slow.
Yes.
Well, but again, it doesn't necessarily,
There's a really interesting tension here, which sort of joins what Scott says to kind of a lot of this other stuff, which is what my sort of colleague Jonathan Stray would call epistemology on deadline, which is like just how can you get the best, how can you get the best knowledge, information, etc. published, journalism published quickly.
cases until you talk to them and ask them and say, this is what I need to do. I found them to be very responsive when you start to open that up and say, this is what I need to do. You only get in trouble when you sort of fly under that radar and haven't talked to them.
Obviously, as journalists, the words flying under the radar are like sort of, immediately appealing.
This is what I was curious about with the best practice in the private sector work,
Yep.
because they are very sensitive to deadlines.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So one of the arguments I make is this notion that I alluded to earlier, this notion that in the wild, wild west, both as individuals and organizations, we need to get better at doing something in a new environment that we're not used to doing, which is having explicit ethical discussions, whether that's in the context of an individual versus a committee reviewing, a research proposal, or whether that's a question about whether, a team of database architects should be actually trying to solve a particular problem, just the human or even profit-oriented motivation to actually solve that problem is a question in and of itself. And we're not used to having those. And there are ways in which we can all learn to get better at doing that, to your point. And, in our breakout group, we talked yesterday about ways to learn how to collaborate better around, frankly, what can be difficult and, somewhat frightening and tough questions. Ethics is hard. It comes fraught with the potential for judgment, for the fear of being wrong. And the better that we can be more explicit and transparent about how we're coming to that endeavor as a collective group of individuals, the better off we're going to be.
And maybe kind of just to connect the point to what Dave was saying about universities, if we get something out of this as, the Tower Centre, it's what I'm hearing over and over again, is you need a kind of clearinghouse for the conversations and the resources for, expertise that, journalists can feel safe asking at kind of, rapid pace. And so maybe, the trusted environment, which is not going to be available to most newsrooms to, have individually, is something where kind of universities or Matt's department, our department, whatever, kind of can start to kind of create some of those resource centres and have that conversation in public, so that everybody feels that they have a chance to shape it. Sorry, question. Okay, I've got one question here first, and then there. Yeah.
So I want to change the topic a team. I want to talk about Tesla the Times for a second.
Oh.
So when all of that fun stuff happened, Nick Bilton, who's one of the technology reporters, had this very interesting tweet after Tesla released their data log saying, fascinating that with TeslaGate, people immediately trusted data over the human, even though the humans wrote the code that gathered the data. And I just thought it was really interesting how a lot of people, once the data just was released, it was automatically correct.
Yes, even though it wasn't, oddly.
Right.
Yeah.
I just want to bring that up and because I think we're talking about a lot of data now and kind of leaving the journalism part behind, but just the tensions between those two, and if someone then releases data, do we just assume that's correct?
Yeah, and I was going to say, I would add to that what Margaret Sullivan, the public editor, said, where she said the notebook on the front seat is no longer enough. That if we're going to be tracked and monitored and measured as journalists, and that Tesla is a really extreme example of that, but you can imagine everybody's conversation now as a journalist is recorded. You just have to accept that all your interactions are recorded. So how do you?
That's true as a citizen. I tell my students that if you really have something that you do not want a third party to know about, you get off your chair, you walk down the hall, you talk to the person face to face, and then you go back. You do not put it on email, you do not put it on a cell phone. The only way you can be sure that your conversation will go to the person you wanted to go to and no further is if you know and trust the person, and if you do it face to face, like the spies who meet on a park bench.
And don't take your cell phone with you when you walk to
That's
go have
right.
that conversation.
Right. Really, that's the only way.
But I think the Tesla point is an interesting one, because there is, again, that it's a kick up in process and people believing the data, but isn't part of journalism also to try and have that critical conversation quickly? I mean, it was interesting that, again, it ran ahead of the publishing schedule of the newspaper of the Times, and the conversation went into a much broader community. But the counterfactual.
But didn't it end on, like, the interesting part was that it started with whatever his article was, and then, but the like output of discourse continue to get smaller and smaller, because like Mark Sullivan's great blog, but how many people really read that? And it's just interesting that you
I think probably more, well, that would be an interesting question. Did more people read that than read Elon Musk's original post on it? It's kind of like, but also they're probably two separate communities, because back to the point that Rommel made, that if people are kind of hanging, the Tesla enthusiasts wanted to believe that he had driven in circles around a car park to flatten the battery.
Musk is like an angel.
Whilst everybody else John Broder wanted everybody to know that he couldn't find the plug, the socket, and was driving around the car park in the dark because he couldn't find the socket. So it's, but it's a good point.
So what I would argue is that this is sort of Aristotelian rhetoric.
I love it when he talks technical.
Thank you. Which is that the most powerful argument, right, is the ethical argument, and the least powerful argument is the logical argument. And so what has happened is that ethos, the appeal to authority, used to be to the ancient masters or the gods or something like that. But now, in fact, data has the ethos. So if you can figure out a way to work the data in, then you have a more powerful rhetorical argument. And it's really not about the data so much as classical rhetoric.
That's why I'd like to answer your question about what would I do in the newsroom. There's no such thing as a good technology or a bad technology. It's the human choice behind its use that makes it one or the other. So in the newsroom, I'm going to be dealing at the hiring stage. I want to hire somebody who wants to do the right things for the right reasons.
Can I just bring up one last really tiny point? The interesting thing about what you said is thinking of like Tim Grosclose and his whole point of that, like, we'll just reporters will just find the quotes that they want to find to support the point. Is you can, I think, make a good argument that I can just find the data that supports my point. And
That's called academia.
That's called academia, indeed. Or indeed life. So yes.
Sure. So it seemed like, to Joanne's point about how the legal system is reactive and can't get out ahead of these questions, I think that absolutely applies to the ethical and all the other dimensions. And I think about the case of Google Glass. I mean, we've been dealing with the implications of everyone having cameras for decades, and now all of a sudden it's a camera on your face, and everyone sort of freaks out and has to start over. And so I think, where the Tao Center could come in is you need to have an ethical discussion about a new type of sensing the next week. And sort of these longer timelines, I just think aren't going to work, because to his point about measuring steps in a hallway, something that takes one data point about a step maybe can't be used to measure someone's walking patterns, but something with two sensors can be used. And so I think specificity is really important.
But it's more than that, because most people don't care about Google Glass. They probably can't afford it. They probably don't know about it. And the example I will give is, look what happened with the air traffic controllers a few weeks ago. When all of a sudden sequestration started to have effects, people do get in planes. It's a day-to-day activity, and man, that got dealt with in a week. And the reason why Congress is running around in circles with Google Glass is because they can't do other minor things like deal with the budget. So they're certainly not going to be dealing with Google Glass. There has to be pressure from the public.
And the other point I guess I would make is you cannot deal with it on a specific basis that narrowly. That is, the arbitrage that you can do around coming up with a different kind of a device that isn't covered by a rule. Like when you start talking about these things specifically, there are so many possible cases that there's not enough paper in the world to print the legal code that you would need in order to deal with the cases. You need to have sort of a principle, right? So the kind of a principle like images are not allowed in a courtroom,
First, do no harm.
Right? You're not allowed to take pictures, period. Doesn't matter what kind of camera you have. And then you hire artists to sketch in. You know, it used to work that way. Now,
Yes.
apparently in Britain, they haven't changed it, but they have here.
It still, I was going to say, it still works that way in Britain, where we have no written constitution, but you can't take a picture in a court. But you can draw a badly rendered picture of someone in some really nasty pastels. Sorry, John.
So to bring it to the real, and I've asked for the mic and I've turned it off for reasons so if you're not tweeting about this, I'd appreciate it. We collect a lot of information from people about their locations. We ask them to participate, whether it's a cicada tracker, whether or not we ask them for their snowfall. And we are very clear about that we're going to put these dots on a map. We had a case where somebody asked us whether or not we could be sure that they would not be identified because their spouse doesn't know who they are and they have a restraining order against them and they're worried about the safety of their ex-spouse.
Then I would say, it's better you don't participate. That's it?
That's what we did. But who else out there is in that situation, participated, but didn't ask us? That point did not end up in our project, for example.
I'm curious, did you guys talk about that possibility before you initiated the project?
In any situation, we think about how people can be identified by putting themselves on a map.
Yep.
And in society these days, we're doing it all the time.
Yeah.
Parents does. We do not, as a matter of course, put identifying in the classic way, people's email addresses or their names with their points.
Yeah.
We also, in some cases, will either obfuscate the longitudes and longitudes, or in the more benign situations, we might just make it so you can't zoom down to somebody.
But you got to be reasonable here, because the standard under the law is what would an ordinary, reasonable, prudent person do under the circumstances. So the reasonable thing for you is to let people know that what your data collection is going to do. You cannot know that that person had a restraining order. It is not possible for you to know that. And so it's that person's responsibility to let you know and make the decision. And once they do let you know, then you're responsible for saying, you know what, we're just not going to do it. So you can't presuppose, I mean, if a person has a restraining order out, they know that they're in danger in the first place, they should be thinking of that. You cannot put that in their head.
We're so close to being up to time, so if we, this
Yeah.
question here and then.
I have one quick question about more of the legal framework and how some of the existing precedents, like wiretapping laws and even things like trespassing and kind of this public-private boundary that we've discussed will affect our ability to implement some of these projects. And with that in mind, it seems like a lot of the private sector is way far out ahead of us. And as journalists, when do we start looking at people like Google and Facebook and all of these people who are already collecting lots of data and look at them as sources of data for us instead of making big investments in making our own sensor networks, and what's their legal obligations or their framework for providing data to journalists?
I mean, this is a kind of really interesting question, which is, I've always felt because Facebook and Google and Twitter collect a lot of data, that probably we have to get used to thinking about doing it ourselves. It's not, how much do you outsource of that kind of information flow? And that's
Well, the answer is there's no answer yet. And let me tell you about wiretapping, because it's illustrative of the problem. The first time we had a wiretapping statute was in the 1930s. Why? Because in the 1930s, people started getting phones, and we started dealing with warrants, and then there was an electronic, I forget the name of the statute, but there was a statute that specifically addressed it. Okay, so the concept of a wiretap over time originally was in tandem with, well, not a wiretap, but overhearing somebody's conversation was originally tied to a physical intrusion. If you were on the person's property as such that you can overhear what they're talking about, the trespass was an element of the wrong, so there had to be a trespass. Okay, so fast forward, and the technology allows us to overhear conversations without being anywhere near the property. And so you have a whole line of cases where the concept of trespass just falls apart because the technology doesn't do that anymore. And there was discussions in the court about a spike mic. This was a mic that gets put into the wall. Well, if you're on the wall, that's clearly a trespass. If you go inside the house, that's a trespass. But what about if it's just in the wall? Is that a physical intrusion that constitutes a trespass? And finally, at that point, the court said, this is not what we're doing. What we are protecting here is we are protecting the conversation. Okay, and so there was a very famous case, U.S. v. Katz, where the idea was we are protecting people, not places, and therefore the interest to be protected was the conversation without regard to the physical elements of the wiretap. Fast forward to the late 1980s, and now you have a case with a satellite. And a satellite is being used to monitor the Dow Chemical Company in Midland, Michigan. Long story short, the court it was a warrantless search, and the court wanted to uphold that search because at that point in the history of the court, they were not going to do anything that weakened search and seizure because of the drug war that was going on in the late 80s. And so they upheld this case with the satellite, and they went back to trespass again because that's the conceptual hook that they needed. So what happens is that the decisions change based on the elements of the technology. And the court said something they didn't even have to say. They said, well, you know, the search that we are upholding today was on an airplane, and that's a technology that everybody has access to. I would take issue with that. But if the search was a satellite, we might have to do something different. They didn't even have to bring it in, and they did because they needed some technology to distinguish what they wanted to do. So with weird stuff now, like cyberspace and everything else, they're just beginning to conceptualize this stuff.
You're looking in the wrong place for the data. You can buy that data from other people who sell data, right? So I'd argue, you know, you go to CoreLogic, you go to ADP, you can buy data which is more about financial stuff, and you know, so for stories around the follow the money kind of a thing. A couple companies back, we did that. We got the CoreLogic data, we got another data set. Both of which, one was mortgage-backed security data that had all of this anonymized mortgage data, and then this other one was credit scores, which had all these anonymized credit scores, and by doing sophisticated analyses, you could identify people who had gotten second mortgages fraudulently, and you could identify the individual. So we came up with what percentage of second mortgages were fraudulently obtained, and we. Not being journalists, we didn't publish their names.
But you did sell it for a profit. No, you know, that's why that was your human motivation, right?
So, but what I'm saying is you're looking for things, the kind of data that Google or Facebook collect is one class of information, but there's a lot of some information that you can buy from people who are more than happy to sell it to you, where there are all kinds of really great stories that can be created.
The bigger question underlying this whole conversation is we may very well be at a point in our history where our cultural values toward the concept of privacy are undergoing sea changes.
And I have a resource around that. So there's an organization out there that's started by a couple of law professors at Michigan State University, Daniel Katz and a woman named Renee Kanake, which is Knake. And they started an organization called Reinvent Law, and they're really exploring in great detail in collaboration and partnership with technologists and business folks, really. So there's a course. So they had their first conference last fall in Silicon Valley. They had 40 speakers on sort of both sides of the question, and those those two worlds aren't going to be that separate, I think in the future in some way. And they developed a course in partnership with the Michigan State University Broad School of Business that explicitly, I think the title is Law, Ethics, and Our, Future, or something like that. And that's part of what that curriculum is going to explore for you folks that are interested in tactical, real-world best practices and how those worlds are, going to start to come together and how they're going to influence each other for the future.
Okay, that was a great discussion. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you as well for feeding into that.